the Iranian public did not react in the way that Israel and the United States anticipated. They didn't see the war as an opportunity to rise up. They rallied to the flag, and they began to interpret the war not as a war on the Islamic Republic to liberate them, but as a war on their country designed to break it down, destroy its infrastructure, and potentially to disintegrate the country. The old order in the Middle East has basically been destroyed. Israel became unleashed. It gradually became viewed by the Arabs as either a problem because of the Palestinian issue or even as a threat. Even countries that have a peace treaty with Israel, like Jordan or Egypt, have begun to view a certain security threat coming from Israel directly or indirectly because of its handling of the Palestinians. What came out of this war was an Islamic Republic that, yes, it was hugely battered and damaged by the war, but nevertheless was unbowed by the American pressure. Israel called victory in Lebanon too quickly. It's kind of like mission accomplished with George Bush. So we killed Hassan Nasrallah, we destroyed these things, we've gone into South Lebanon.
You had the pager attacks.
Well, yeah, pager attacks, killing of Hassan Nasrallah, invasion of South Lebanon, capturing of all of these hills. So I finished Hezbollah. And then, but Hezbollah, perhaps Iranians knew this, that was not finished. And Hezbollah, in a way, has been back. It has been killing IDF soldiers. It's been attacking northern Israel
with drones.
With drones, but the political now message inside Israel is that, well, wait a minute, this was not mission accomplished, like you said, just like it was not mission accomplished with Tehran, like you promised.
The ceasefire is over. At least that's what US President Donald Trump said after the US launched more than 80 strikes on Iran. We're at a critical time in efforts to keep the ceasefire between the US and Iran to stick. The dispute is of existential importance to Iran, who controls the Strait of Hormuz. There are still talks going on, but if Trump really is returning to war, he knows he's got fewer cards to play than Iran has. With me to discuss all of these issues is Vali Nasr, one of the leading analysts on Iran and the Middle East. He's Professor of International Affairs at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and he's no stranger to policy making at the highest level. He was senior advisor to US Ambassador Richard Holbrooke between 2008 and 2011. He's the author of a wide range of books, in the latest of which, Iran's Grand Strategy. Professor Nasr argued that Iran's actions were driven by a pragmatic pursuit of interest rather than ideology. Professor Nasr, welcome to Middle East Eye. Professor, how do you assess the strategic miscalculations made by the US and Israel in expecting a quick victory and regime change during this recent conflict?
The decision to go to war with Iran, both by Israel starting in June of 2025 and then again in February in collaboration with the United States, was based on intelligence of the way they read not only the innards of the Islamic Republic, but also the mood of the Iranian people and how they may act. I'm sure Israel and the United States had a lot of intelligence about Iran, gauging the mood of the people and the fragility of the regime. But intelligence is not perfect. Sometimes there are huge gaps in it, and sometimes there's a matter of interpretation. And sometimes, as we saw with America's invasion of Iraq in 2003, there could be cherry-picking of intelligence or certain bias in how you want the intelligence to be reflected. I think Israel, first of all, and the United States to some extent, had spent a great deal of resources directing the anger of the people inside Iran and Iranian diaspora outside in a particular direction, in support for regime change, in support for a successor ideal regime encapsulated in the return of the monarchy. But very interestingly, in getting the Iranian public to at least a segment of it to welcome the war and to see the war as cathartic, easy, decisive, painless solution to the political impasse that the people felt. And it was to a large extent effective. But I think both Israel and the United States overread how effective it had been. and that the mood of the Iranian people could change when the war starts, and that what the Iranians would assume or want when they were confronting the Islamic Republic directly, let's say in January during the massive uprising, would be very different when they confronted the bombing of the country. And secondly, I think they underestimated the resilience of the Islamic Republic. Ideas that the regime was very, very narrow in its base, things that became very prevalent in popular discourse came out of the media, social media. There are only 200,000 people taking 90 million people hostage. Gives you a sense that it's very easy to remove this regime. And you could see that President Trump bought into this in a way to think that Iran would be as easy as Venezuela. It would be less a war and more a special forces operation of just removing the head of the state. But in reality, two things turned out differently. One is the regime didn't fall. It proved to be not a regime dependent on personalities, and particularly one-man rule, which is prevalent in the Middle East. That's what we're familiar with. That was also true of the Shah's Iran, that this is actually much more of a system that is multinodal, that has a mosaic conception of authority, that can continue to function amoeba-like almost if you decapitate it. And secondly, that the Iranian public did not react in the way that Israel and the United States anticipated. They didn't see the war as an opportunity to rise up. They rallied to the flag, and they began to interpret the war not as a war on the Islamic Republic to liberate them, but as a war on their country designed to break it down, destroy its infrastructure, and potentially to disintegrate the country. And so whether they hated the Islamic Republic or loved the Islamic Republic, there was a massive reaction against the war in Iran, which at some level is manifested in the number of people who've come out for the funeral of Iran's supreme leader, former supreme leader. And so I think these were miscalculations. You might say Israel misunderstood the intelligence and perhaps furthermore used the misinterpreted intelligence to actually convince an audience of one in Washington that this is a fast, quick, decisive war that would give him very quick glory.
You've described this war as a potential Vietnam moment or Suez moment for American global standing. Will the outcome of this conflict reshape American influence in the Middle East?
I think it will. I think this war will shape American standing in the Middle East for two reasons. One is that starting with the October 7 Hamas attack on Israel and then the Gaza war, and now much more so with Israel's two wars with Iran, the second one with the United States, the old order in the Middle East has basically been destroyed. Now, for better or for worse, there was an order. Yes, there were conflicts here and there, but there was an order in which the United States was the backbone of the security in the Middle East, in an alliance with a group of authoritarian Arab regimes that were very close to the U.S. Yes, there were pockets periodically that were outside of this, Syria or Lebanon as a failed state, or for a period Iraq, but by and large, this was the shape. And in fact, it had been consolidating recently from the Obama period onwards around the idea that Israel and this alliance of Arab states would congeal together as a major axis to contain Iran and keep it outside of the Middle East order, cut its tentacles in the Arab world, limit its room to maneuver, deny it ability to project power. And this was aided also by a string of American military bases around Iran that would protect this alliance, arming both Arabs and Israelis in order to be able to take Iran on, and then putting massive economic sanctions on Iran that kept increasing in a way to hobble the Islamic Republic. Now, that order has broken down. First of all, Israel became unleashed. It gradually became viewed by the Arabs as either a problem because of the Palestinian issue or even as a threat. Even countries that have a peace treaty with Israel, like Jordan or Egypt, have begun to view a certain security threat coming from Israel directly or indirectly because of its handling of the Palestinians. Israel is actually expanding geographically into Gaza, potentially into annexation of the West Bank. It's unlikely to leave southern Lebanon anytime soon or voluntarily, and is also occupying parts of Syria that is unlikely to give back, and wants to dictate the form of government and the form of political life in Lebanon and Syria. And then is also, extending its ability to decide things into the Persian Gulf region when it attacked Qatar, when it, with the alliance that it has with UAE and Bahrain. So, you have a very different Israel that is also changing the Arabs' perception of where the balance of power in the region lies. So that's why we see Saudi Arabia trying to band together with Pakistan, Egypt, and Turkey to create a certain counterbalance. And so whatever order comes about afterwards, the role of the United States in it would be different. And the second outcome of this war, in other words, once we step back from the day-to-day battle between Iran and the United States, is the following. That the United States, which is this big superpower, which was the dominant outside force in the Middle East, went to war with the main nemesis in the Middle East on the assumption that it would be decisive and would make the idea of containment of Iran no longer necessary because it will remove the problem, right? It failed. Israel went to war with Iran twice in June and February, and it failed in knocking out the enemy. In the second war, it went and brought the United States, the big source of support it has, to do the job, and that failed. Economic blockade on Iran failed. And what came out of this war was an Islamic Republic that, yes, it was hugely battered and damaged by the war, but nevertheless was unbowed by the American pressure. It came out of the war not only not defeated, foiling America's plans, showing to the world, not just to the Middle East, showing to the world the limits of America's exercise of power, right? And then actually gained certain strategic victories out of the war that has given it the ability to negotiate with the United States. And that's why the issue of the Strait of Hormuz is so significant, why Iran won't let it go, and why the United States is determined to take it away from Iran. And so the United States went into this war as an uber power of the Trumpian era, and has come out of this war somewhat diminished in terms of its aura of power. And the final point is that the Gulf countries were the bastions of American bases, etc., have found out that the United States actually became not the defender of security, but the cause of insecurity. It went to a war not to defend them from an Iranian attack, but actually to fulfill an Israeli project with Iran. They became collateral damage in that war, which means that the American-Israeli alliance actually ended up being a danger to them, not a source of support. And secondly, when the war came, the United States proved unable or unwilling to defend them. And so they were battered by Iran as a consequence. So as angry as they are about Iran, their notion of what is the value and efficacy of an American security umbrella is now open to question.
How do you read where we are right now? Trump has just said that the ceasefire is no more, it's broken down. The dispute is about who controls the Strait of Hormuz and what channels of shipping they use. Is this the current tit for tat about an under-negotiated MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, or are we on a bumpy path to some form of peace? Because while the attacks are taking place, there are still technical talks taking place as well.
My sense is that we are on a bumpy path to peace, largely because one thing that came out of this war is that the United States understands it cannot defeat Iran, not with the level of military engagement that it's willing to undertake. And Iran also understands that it's not going to defeat the United States. So at some point, they would have to arrive at a sustainable status quo. I don't want to call it peace, but a sustainable status quo that both can live with. The moment they signed the MOU, that wasn't the case, although the promise is that the MOU would lead after 60 days to something. But the reality of it is that when the MOU was signed, Iran still had difficulty to see how it would translate what it won in the war into real tangible gains. And the United States was not satisfied with losing the war. It's not natural to Americans to come out short. And they wanted to reverse the verdict at the moment of the signing of the deal. But the reality is this. Yes, there is ambiguity in the memorandum, and particularly the Article 5 over what does the opening of the strait mean, maybe legally in a narrow sense open to interpretation. But this is more than a misunderstanding over wording. I think Iran saw that the United States signed the memorandum and immediately began to back away from it in a following form. One is that initially the talk or the promise was that maybe up to $24 to $30 billion of Iran's frozen assets would be released. The number began to be sliced in half, and then in half, and then in half. And so the Iranians basically began to understand that actually maybe nothing will come. Nothing will come in 60 days. This was just illusory. There is this talk of $300 billion investment in reconstructing Iran. That I don't think the Iranians seriously think will ever materialize. It's a nice talking point, and it's more material in the West and in the United States in terms of attacking Trump than it is for them. And the oil waivers is not going to, even if it happens in 60 days, is not going to really address the depth of the economic damage that Iran has suffered in the war. So whatever economic benefits were put into the memorandum, the Iranians discovered that the U.S. was actually not going to deliver in that, nowhere near there. Secondly, very quickly, it sounded like Vice President Vance was saying one thing, and then Secretary Rubio started saying something else. Like Vice President Vance would say, well, and the president said, well, Iran can have missiles. We cannot expect them not to have missiles. And then Secretary Rubio would say, no, they cannot. And so then Iranians began to see, is that a confused administration, or is this a good cop, bad cop, or is Trump simply reneging? And Vance is being sort of sidelined in favor of Rubio. The U.S.-Israel-Lebanon deal to the Iranians was basically a reneging on the memorandum, on the very first article of the memorandum. It was a very clever way, the Iranians thought, to basically take away any leverage Iran was putting in the memorandum over Lebanon, take it off the table, by basically saying Israel is not occupying. Israel is in Lebanon now based on an understanding with the government of Lebanon. And this has the legitimacy of the government of Lebanon supporting this, right? So you as an outsider have no reason to call this an occupation or to have any say in it. And so the Iranians saw that also as a way in which the United States signed something and then immediately tried to renegotiate. But the most important part was that when the U.S. began to encourage or facilitate or to deny Iran the ability to dictate, to allow tankers and cargo ships coming through this Strait of Hormuz to go through the southern channel along the Omani border as opposed to the northern channel, and not to ask Iran for permission to go through the south. The Iranians interpreted this that the United States is now trying to take away their control of the strait. So, or degrade their ability to exercise control. And once de facto that control is weakened, then Iran really doesn't have anything on the table to negotiate. So that's why basically they try to sort of warn the United States or impose cost on the United States for trying to play this game, which is by hitting those two tankers. The U.S. has started hitting Iran, and now the pattern of hitting Iran, particularly on southern Iran, is very clear, is directed at degrading Iran's ability to close the strait, right? So it's all about the strait. It's not about a misunderstanding of a few lines in the memorandum. It is largely based on the fact that the United States wants to use the memorandum period to catch its breath, to regroup and to weaken Iran's hand in Lebanon, with the Strait, and also not really give Iran what it was promised. And the Iranians are basically willing to fight for the Strait. They're basically saying, we're not going to let you take the leverage away. And so this is now becoming a conflict. I think both sides are trying to change the balance of power. The Iranians want the United States to become convinced that he has no option but to accept Iran's control over the Strait and to desist from trying to use the MOU as a sort of a stopgap measure to build more pressure on Iran. And the United States is hoping to use these attacks on Iran to convince Iran to basically back off and accept what's on the table. And because that's, I think, the approach President Trump has had all along. I don't want to really negotiate. I want to give you a dictate. And if you think you have a leverage, I'm going to destroy it so you don't have a leverage anymore. So at some point, I think they will arrive at the maximum of what this approach can achieve for both of them. It may not be right now, it may not be tomorrow, but at some point, I think the U.S. will arrive at a point that the cost of trying to bully Iranians to give up the Strait of Hormuz may be too high, and the Iranians also realize that at some point they would have to accept a workable arrangement with the United States, and they can't defeat the U.S. here.
I mean, has Iran become too confident in the sense that it hit a Qatari LNG tanker, container? Qatar was one of the negotiators. It hit another ship in the Gulf of Oman. Now, Oman is supposed to share the profits of the fees that they're going to charge after 60 days in the Strait of Hormuz. How do you assess the effect these specific attacks have had on Qatar, or are they just going to swallow their pride and say, fine, we're still on the same course?
I mean, I'm not in the decision making, but what I can't say. Let me put it this way: I can't say with absolute certitude what the decision making in Iran was as to whether they should target Oman, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, which was also one of the tankers. But I think the logic in Iran is that the Strait of Hormuz is so important to them. And this is an existential war for Iran. And that when you're sinking, when you're facing a sort of such a dire situation, friend or foe doesn't matter after a point. And if the United States is going to use Iran's good relations with Qatar or semi-good relations with Saudi Arabia or very friendly relations with Oman as a way of weakening the Strait of Hormuz, that's not going to work. So I think the message is that, yes, we love Qatar, we love Oman, but that doesn't mean that you could sort of hide the project of weakening our hold over the Strait behind these friendly forces, or that because we have this relationship with Qatar or Oman, that somehow means that we're going to hold back in terms of defending our control of the Strait.
In your recent book, Iran's Grand Strategy, you argue that Iran's actions are driven by a pragmatic pursuit of national interest rather than pure ideology. How should this perspective change the way the West approaches negotiations and approaches Iran in the future?
I mean, for too long, the West has hid behind the idea that these are irrational, unreasonable people. And even very recently, Secretary Rubio said something like, we're dealing with a country whose leadership is apocalyptic. That basically means that we're not playing chess with an opponent, right? And that's exactly why we got so surprised in this war, because you basically become victim of your own shibboleths. The reality is that the other side's assumptions about national security, their strategy may be not the one that the West likes or shares or approves of, or may very well find it menacing and threatening. But if it wants to deal with it and triumph over it, it has to take it seriously. It has to understand that the other side has some secular objectives. we could say that also about Xi Jinping or about Putin. The idea of imperial aggrandizement is not some kind of an Eastern ideological religious construct. It exists in European history. It's always existed, right? So you could say that your adversary, in this case Iran, has maybe a wrong-headed view of its national security. It has a wrong understanding of U.S. intentions, etc. And it's actually following a very clear strategy, which we can understand based on secular, rational principles. And I think that basically gives you a way to think about what you can encourage and what you can discourage. And also understand how the other side may be strategizing, why they may be taking certain actions the way they do. And in particular, since this war has started, we've now increasingly seeing an adversary for the West that is methodic, has a game plan for survival, for projection of power, for fighting, for hitting things, that is based on their understanding of the situations they're in. And what is largely absent in their conversation are themes that have dominated in the West or in the Arab world, that they're out there to export the revolution, or this is all about apocalyptic view of religion. It's just not present in that conversation.
As you've noted, and I've done as well, I mean, the Iranians fulfilled their obligations when they signed the JCPOA, but Obama did not. The sanctions weren't lifted. In the same vein, Joe Biden carried on Trump's maximum pressure sanctions. How have the two attacks shaped the internal debate in Iran regarding the benefits of a nuclear deterrent?
Well, I mean, the experience that Iran had with Obama and Biden, and it's actually largely missing in the conversation in the West, is that for the West, even right now as we're talking, for many observers, the issue is that the United States said it will lift sanctions if Iran signs the deal. But for the Iranians, what the U.S. says no longer matters, what the implementation matters, right? We just don't see why is it that they don't bite into the idea that President Trump says, I will lift sanctions if you actually negotiate, because actually they did sign a deal with Obama and they did their part. The U.S. really didn't do much in terms of lifting of sanctions, right? And so I think Iran is now in a phase where it's not its decisions are no longer driven by what the West says or even what the West signs, but what the West implements. And again, this memorandum of understanding is a repetition of that. There's certain things they signed about the economics, which none of it has really come through, right? So implementation matters a lot. That is now a major key. I think in Iran there is a sense that their nuclear doctrine between 2003 and 2025, over this 2-decade plus, was actually a mistake, because the old supreme leader did not want nuclear weapons. He gave a fatwa against it, which was really directed at silencing the demand for nuclear weapons at home, not so much to convince the West about his intentions. And he basically followed the strategy that Iran will not build a bomb. Iran wants a civilian program, is willing to negotiate over it, and is willing to show the West that the program it's civilian. And he failed at that. And the JCPOA was proof that he failed at that. And the Vienna talks were proof that he failed at that. And so there are many people in Iran who say that either he should have, Iran, like Pakistan, India, Israel, North Korea, should have just gone for the bomb and not talked so much about a nuclear program, and would have built the bomb, for better or for worse. Or it should have never pursued this civilian nuclear program at all, because the program cost Iran a huge amount of money, brought enormous amount of sanctions and misery on the country, and in the end brought war on the country, right? So there is a sense that the old program, the old approach of we're going to convince the West that our program is civilian, just doesn't work. So Iran is actually at that juncture, which either it really has to give up its nuclear program altogether, and I don't think they're averse to that. It's just that they want to make sure that they don't give it up and then the U.S. pockets that and then leaves the deal again, or they have to build a bomb. Now, the voice about building the bomb in Iran has become much louder because of the wars, because Iran does not have a deterrence to prevent Israel mowing the lawn or the U.S. attacking it again. The problem is that it's difficult to get there now. It's as much as progress as Iran has shown, it's going to take a number of years for it to get to having sufficient number of nuclear warheads and delivery systems to have a genuine deterrence.
So all the stuff that Netanyahu was saying, Ditkov was saying they're 2 weeks away or a month away from a bomb is nonsense.
Yes, it's nonsense. I mean, first of all, they don't know. At most, what Iran has is a week away from having enough fissile material that could be used for a bomb. But actually making a bomb, that's a whole different industrial project. And first of all, according to Netanyahu, Iran has been a few months from making a bomb for now many, many years. Yes, Iran is far too close to a bomb for comfort. That goes without saying. But for it to be able to actually get to nuclear deterrence, it's not going to be within 2 weeks. It's anywhere from 2 years to 5 years, you would say. Years ago, Zbigniew Brzezinski once said that to have 2 bombs is to invite invasion. You have to have 30 bombs before you actually have a deterrence. So even if you went by something like that, they're not there. So how many more times can they get attacked in a much more vicious and aggressive way if actually they were building a bomb and this was discovered, right? I mean, right now, I think they know that the U.S. knows and Israel knows that there is nothing happening on the nuclear front. And so, they're not willing to actually go to a much higher level war with Iran. So yes, the talk is there, but it's not an easy decision.
What specific economic or diplomatic incentives do you believe could effectively persuade Iran to abandon its pursuit of a nuclear weapon without resorting to military action?
I think there's not one major massive deal because of the lack of trust that has now been built because of the failure of JCPOA, because of maximum pressure sanctions, because of the 2 wars. But I think the Iranians would have to gradually move towards a deal based on reciprocity and proof that actually what they give up is met by actually tangible gains. So if they give up X, they actually would get Y, and that sanctions really would get lifted. I think, unfortunately, there's a view in Iran, particularly among those who don't see much point in talking to the U.S. or are opposed to talking to the U.S., want a nuclear program to continue, etc., who basically saying the U.S. is never, ever going to lift sanctions. It's never going to happen. They're stringing you along. Don't waste your time talking to them. So at some point, the United States needs to disabuse that voice in Iran of its reasoning. There has to be actual sanctions that get lifted in exchange for something that happens. Like if you said, I'm going to lift these sanctions for 1 year even, if for 1 year IAEA has unimpeded access to, let's say, inspection, and that actually gets implemented, that would give a basis for the argument for people who are actually favoring negotiations. I mean, part of the problem in Iran, whether it's President Pezeshkian, Foreign Minister Araghchi, Speaker of the Parliament Ghalibaf, just like the generation before of President Rouhani, Foreign Minister Zarif, is that they are now increasingly being viewed as naive, talking about actual dividends of negotiations that never going to materialize.
How has the recent war altered the security calculus of the Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and the UAE regarding their reliance on the United States?
I think the Gulf states all are facing a major dilemma. They are now facing a much more aggressive adversary on the other side of the Persian Gulf. and Iran, that for the first time has now crossed the Rubicon of viciously attacking them, destroying, hard military infrastructure, etc. So in some ways, it's a greater threat than it was before. But the traditional umbrella of protection for the Gulf, which is the United States, actually has proved to be wanting. The U.S. has come up short. So, and also there is this wild card of Israel out there too, because Israel wants to take the war to Iran. Israel will bring its war to Iran onto the shores of the Gulf countries, particularly because it has now an alliance with a few of them, and that the United States is not going to control Israel. I mean, that's also part of the conclusion that was made. So the key question is, given these fundamentals, given that the world in which the Gulf countries lived, where they would say, we can have these relations with Iran, which would make us no longer be their target. And so long as they don't target us, U.S. won't go to war. So it's essentially, we have these bases and U.S. material which don't need to be used, and we can basically pursue future economics in our countries, keeping this war at bay, is no longer there. What I think is happening is that each of them is reacting in a different way. They are talking, some of them are talking more about engaging Iran even more than before as a way of trying to control Iranian aggression against them, but at the same time talking about resiliency, spending more on military protection, and finding other allies than the United States. In other words, trying to hedge or increase the base of military support, etc., that they have. Some of them are doubling down on the U.S. and Israel, like UAE and Bahrain, or perhaps Kuwait. They want even more America, more Israel, and much more of a militaristic reaction to Iran. And so we don't know where the dust will settle. I think at the end of this, there's not going to be one GCC. I mean, GCC now is more of an address than a reality. GCC was conceived as kind of like a NATO for the Gulf, around the idea that everybody's against Iran and everybody shares the same strategy of how to contain Iran, backed by the United States. Now you have such divergence of reaction to this war, of how they're going to manage this, that it's sort of a cohesive GCC no longer makes sense. And we're always also seeing these fissures show up in the form of Israeli, UAE, also clashing of heads, which could become even more important. So the Gulf definitely has a security dilemma. We're still in the fog of war. We're too close to it to see where they're going to go. But the world in which the security world in which they existed has broken down. The United States is not offering a clear path forward. And there's a sense that there is no out-of-the-box solution that can give any of these countries the degree of confidence they had in peace and security that they had before the February war started.
What about Russia and China capitalizing on the gulf of distrust that has emerged between the Gulf and Washington?
Well, in the world that we live, anytime you have a diminishment of the United States, something else fills the vacuum. It's not like necessarily the Chinese are looking to come in with a very clear strategy. But in reality is that if the Gulf becomes less reliant on the U.S., that in varieties of things from trade, technology, military, it's going to look to China to a greater extent. But for China, the Middle East is much more complicated than for the United States. For the United States, the Gulf for a very long time was very easily black and white. Iran is bad. The southern shore is good. We have these alliances. There's only one issue on the table we need to focus on, and it's called Iran. The Chinese have relationship with Iran. They have relationships with the Gulf. They get their energy from the Gulf. They get certain things from Iran. And so for them, it's a much more complicated picture. They're not interested in fighting between the Gulf countries and Iran. But they're also not able or willing to basically impose a peace on the Gulf, nor to make the Gulf an arena of confrontation between China and the United States. I think what likely is that the role of China will unfurl in the region very, very gradually. They may be invited to mediate certain things. They may be asked to provide certain security in some countries, certain security in other countries. If the Gulf countries may look to try to increase Chinese investment and Chinese technology in the Gulf as a way of making the Gulf more committed to their security. Right. So in other words, but then that would come at the cost of the United States. So it is not as if the Gulf can have 100% of American security and then demand of China certain things. It has to give China things, or it has to create greater vested interest for China. And so this is a very difficult balance that the Gulf countries have to deal with. And actually, to their own detriment, because they're not united, they cannot negotiate with China and the United States in a sort of a unionized, collective manner, right? So the minute that trouble hit the Gulf, UAE made a decision that it's going to come out of OPEC. It wants to actually sell its own oil at a much higher level to Asia, China included, at the prices it wants to set. So there goes out of the window the notion that these countries can collectively negotiate with China and the United States to get the best deal out of both of them.
Can we just talk about, particularly with the funeral of Khamenei, former supreme leader, what your reading of the domestic debate in Iran is? You recently noticed that the Islamic Republic is facing a perfect storm of internal and external threats. How has the recent war impacted the domestic stability of this regime?
Well, in the short term, the war actually stabilized it. In other words, if Israel and the United States' assumption was that this external and internal threat could be made to converge to basically crack the Islamic Republic, it didn't, because there was no mass uprising. There was no fifth column or Trojan horse in the form of a popular uprising inside Iran for Israel or the United States. Actually, the opposite happened. There is a rising sense of nationalism in Iran, in my opinion, that is not necessarily always in favor or directed by the Islamic Republic. Many university professors I talk to say that their students have now become hyper-nationalistic. They form first aid, voluntary organizations to help people who have been bombed at bomb sites. There is a sense that this is my country, hands off of it, which is not support for the Islamic Republic, but is actually increasingly anger at the United States. In areas of southern Iran, along the coast of the Sea of Oman and the Persian Gulf, there is enormous rage against U.S. and Israel for the continuous bombing of southern shores of Iran, and so I think in a way the Islamic Republic felt less vulnerable domestically, but that can change once peacetime returns, because then when bread and butter issues return, when people begin to ask that, okay, America and Israel are responsible for this destruction that they have wrought on the country, but how are you going to fix it? Political problems can come back again. And I think the leadership in Iran understands this. That's why the economic points were so forefront in the Memorandum of Understanding, that they do understand that they need economic relief. But at this particular juncture, where the United States is trying to sort of deal with Iran, you have an Iran that has shown before the funeral and through the funeral that don't even think about putting troops on the ground, because you're going to be facing a very hostile population. It's not going to be any flowers and rice thrown at you. If you thought about that, just like we did when we invaded Iraq, forget about that. And that's a very important strategic point they're making. Secondly, the funeral has brought more anger into the open in Iran that is actually constraining the leadership's room to maneuver. in a sense that what is coming out of the street is that don't talk to America. We want revenge. We want accountability. Iran's foreign minister was attacked by rocks and stones on the street as an appeaser. Iran's president was bullied on the streets of Iraq during the march by people chanting appeaser at him, right? So that's what's coming out of the mood. It's now become very clear, and it was also reflected in the funeral, that the Strait of Hormuz has now become a nationalistic issue. It's more important perhaps to Iranians than even the nuclear issue, or even to the right of enrichment, right? The more this has gone on, the more actually it's now become not a regime thing, but a nationalistic thing. So the war has changed Iran. I mean, I changed Iran. I don't mean like Japan or Germany after World War II, that, you sleep in a dictatorship, you wake up in a liberal democracy. But in the sense that the Iranian public has been transformed, even if it dislikes this regime, its perception of politics, its perception of America, its perception of what change is possible or desirable, its perception of war, who's the enemy, what's their national duty, all of these things have changed. And you also have a leadership that is actually has certain degree of confidence. They are confident that they can defend the country. But that does not yet translate it into confidence that they can actually govern the country, right? That will not come until the war is over. And so, either the Islamic Republic can take this moment of national pride and national resistance and anger and translate it into a very different, stable, resilient order, or this can prove to be short-lived. My sense is that this is not clear in Iran. I mean, the shape of the leadership in Iran is not clear. It's not clear how this young, meaning in terms of newly in office, supreme leader is going to rule. There's a lot of assumptions about him. You may say that he has managed the war very well. Now, the big question in front of him is, has he managed the memorandum of understanding very well? And then the next question will be, how is he going to manage the next level? He has his father's name, he has, charisma of the office, etc., but he's by no means as established or as authoritative as his father was after 30-some years. And so his position is much more fragile.
He hasn't appeared in public.
Those add to the problem. I mean, it's very clear why he hasn't appeared in public. I mean, just recently it was in the press that Israel is still trying to assassinate people. So that's a good example. But you cannot ultimately never appear in public. At some point, he cannot be this absent. It won't work. You cannot really run the system that way. So either he has to appear in public, or there probably has to be a different supreme leader, because you cannot have that direction. But even if he appeared in public, which would ameliorate certain things, but I think he has not yet earned any degree of political authority and legitimacy as a ruler of Iran based on his own terms. And until he does, it's going to be his own position is also going to be fragile.
I met someone, an Iranian who lived in North Tehran and also London, and they described to me quite candidly how divided their emotions were between the memory of what happened, the massacre that happened in the January uprising. They said that Dushka machine guns were used against crowds. Between that feeling and the feeling of elation, pumping the air with your fist every time a missile hit Israel. There was a real, it was quite honest conversation. What advice would you give the Iranian opposition?
The reality of it is that the Iranian public has been hugely traumatized. Just in the past 2 years, let's say, even if you went further back, you first had the women life freedom movement, and also that was quite harrowing, although they did win something out of it. The hijab issue pretty much disappeared. So it's the only and first meaningful victory against the Islamic Republic. Then you had the 12-day war, which already was a shock. Then you had the January uprising, which the uprising itself was an event, and then the massacre was an event. In other words, is a historical, moment for them. And then you had the February war. So this is a population that has gone through a lot in the past 2 years, and so its reactions are going to be is going to be difficult to read. And I think when the dust settles, the psychological impact of these 2 years is going to take some time to manifest itself. But you're correct. I mean, I think if the February war had not happened, and if the last picture was that of the massacre of the population and the uprising, I think a very different trajectory would have unfolded in Iran than the one that we are seeing. And so I think there is anger, and there is...
So the attack saved the Islamic Republic?
It saved the Islamic Republic, not to say that it was about to fall apart, but in the sense that it removed the popular pressure on it. And it changed the conversation. That's the best way of putting it, right? Now, in the head of every Iranian, there's multiple conversations that are swirling. So one is that I'm still angry at the brutality and the massacre and the killing, and that I haven't forgotten about that. The second one is, this is my country, and it's being destroyed systematically by United States and Israel, and I'm angry about that. And the third is that I actually feel pride when Iran is seen to be winning. It's not a trivial thing to say that a country that, with its back to the wall for 47 years under sanctions, stand up to the sole superpower around the world and is actually is unbowed. And so that's a moment of pride for them. And then even more complicated, they would say, yes, I know the Basiji forces and I know the Revolutionary Guards and I don't like them, but these are the people who are defending the country. These are the soldiers that are risking their lives. So, it is an extremely complicated set of very polar opposite sets of very powerful feelings at the same time. And I think every Iranian is grappling with which of these dominates in their head. But it's definitely not as black and white as it was in January. In other words, there are people who still are primarily angry at the brutality and the massacre, but also appreciate, the rest of what I said. And there are people who've moved to the middle. I mean, I heard a lot from people who said that, look, the core of the crowds that came out every night in the streets were regime people. Zorka said them, but I went, and I know this person is secular and does not, subscribe to that. Or they said the kids that I saw there were the same kids that were demonstrating. And so, in a way, I think when time and space allows, depending on what the outcome of the war is and how this new Islamic Republic under this new leadership begins to deal with the population, we're going to see which of these sets of conflicting feelings and emotions that the Iranians are feeling will become the dominant one. I don't want to say every Iranian is going to share that, but I think like in every other society, you end up with a particular attitude becoming the one that shapes the politics of Iran.
How one of your earlier books is fascinating, the Shia revival. I'm just wondering how that dynamic between the Shia and Sunni populations in the Middle East have evolved in the recent conflicts. I talk to lots and lots of people who say who look to Iran as a leader, rather than a predator, particularly in Iraq, in all over the place. How's that dynamic changed?
It hasn't. It's just its intensity has changed. I mean, there are many Shias in Pakistan, in the Arab world, who not only look at Iran as leader, they looked at Iran as the protector. I remember this is a number of years ago, a Pakistani doctor, secular doctor, said to me that if it wasn't for Iran, we would have been declared a non-Muslim minority in Pakistan, like the Ahmadis, for instance, right? It's only because of Iran that we actually have survived in Pakistan. It may be an exaggeration, but it was what he believed. And that sense is also present in many other Shia communities around the region. In fact, when Hezbollah first unraveled and then the Assad regime failed and Israel attacked Iran, there was a sense of intense anxiety among the Shias in the region, not necessarily the formal organizations like Hezbollah or Hashd al-Shabi. I'm talking about average Shias, that basically they may be in for a very rough ride if the shadow of Iran over the region recedes. But I think after the collapse of ISIS, in a way, the Shia-Sunni issue began to abate a bit. First of all, it seemed to have run out of gas in some places, and particularly the defeat of ISIS was pretty important. Secondly, the normalization of relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia was very important, because these were the two main sectarian protagonists in the region, or at least that's the way people understood. And it seemed to be that not much was being decided in the region based on this. It was now much more great power rivalry in a way. And I don't think, and then you had the October 7th, and it was very clear that the Palestinian issue and the Israeli confrontation with the Palestinians and its neighbors, etc., became a much bigger issue. And it was very interesting that the main opposition was, other than Hamas, or basically a Shia alliance of Iran, Hashd al-Shabi, Hezbollah, Syria, and the Houthis.
The Houthis, yeah.
But they didn't call themselves that. They called themselves Axis of Resistance. And the language of sectarianism or even Islamic language was singularly absent from the proclamations of either Khamenei or Hassan Nasrallah during that time period. But it's something that's always just under the surface. So in Lebanon, we're talking about Hezbollah disarming. So to the West, it sounds like this is a security issue. There's this bad, quote-unquote, terrorist organization. It's a state within a state. It's a client of another state. It should just lay down its weapons. But in reality, it's really about Shia inclusion and enfranchisement in Lebanese society.
It's about the population of Lebanon. Or
it's about population of Lebanon. Or the Shia resistance to this, beyond Hezbollah itself, is that the Christians or the Sunnis may be happy to win peace with Shia lands, and we're not going to get anything for it. And if Hezbollah goes, then, we're basically minced meat. Or the Iraqis are quite worried about the new regime in Syria, as are the Lebanese Shia, especially when President Trump says Ahmad al-Shara can do a much better job than the Israeli military in dealing with Hezbollah. Basically, he's calling for
But so far, he's refused to do that.
He's refused to do that, but also his patrons have refused to allow him to do that, which is Turkey.
Yeah.
Or Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
In other words, yes, they want Hezbollah to be defanged, but they don't want to do this through a sectarian war, right? They much rather Israel does it, because that's not sectarianism, and it doesn't blow back on them. And so this may still come back. And then this funeral, the way it went to Iraq, it basically was a statement about this Shia community that is larger than Iran, right? And the reception that Khamenei got in Iraq, and perhaps there were Shias from Kuwait or Lebanon, etc., who went to Iraq for those days, also spoke to how anxious and how fragile the Shias of the region are feeling at this moment, that the country, that whether they liked it or not, nevertheless accounted for the space in which they operated and existed, may be in danger.
Two more questions. One on the Palestinian cause, because that really was the core of everything that's happened to Iran. It was a consequence of the Hamas attack. However, the first reaction of Iran and Hezbollah to the Hamas attack was to say, we weren't involved in this. This is not our problem, initially, at least. And now Gaza is not on the table of negotiations. Lebanon is, but Gaza is not. How do you explain that?
I think what Hamas did was an overreach that proved to be a massive strategic mistake for Iran and Hezbollah. Iran did train Hamas, did give it capabilities, but I think it had taken its eye off the ball. Partly, some would say that when Soleimani was the head of Quds Force, he was much more hands-on and he wanted to make all the decisions, whereas his successor was much more willing to delegate a lot of decision-making to the minions. And Hamas decided to do this. And when it did this, it transformed Israel. In a way, Hamas's attack of October 7th, aside from the gruesomeness and the heinousness, was a spectacular success. They were so successful in horrifying Israel and terrifying Israel that it actually changed Israel. And that the Israel that was born out of that attack with the determination to destroy Hamas and destroy the Palestinians and finish Gaza at any cost, basically was not what the axis of resistance had been designed for. So the axis of resistance ultimately was a deterrence system, but the deterrence was only contained Israel in a particular time that Israel would not take certain risks or not want to do certain things. But the Israel that came out of October 7th was willing to assume higher cost and take greater risks and take the fight to Hezbollah and Iran in a way that they couldn't defend against. Now, Hezbollah and Iran, and definitely Bashar Assad, who actually disappeared from the axis of resistance then, were not willing to come in full force in support of Hamas. And there are some people in Iran who think that was a mistake. So they should have not allowed Israel to have the luxury of going after each tentacles of the axis of resistance one at a time. Once Hamas did this, whether or not Tehran approved it, Beirut liked it, they should have, gone in full force. But they didn't, and as a consequence, Israel was able to do what it did, and they lost Syria, and then they were directly attacked. Now, I think there is certain realism there, which is that the Iranians understand that Hamas is not really a useful player. It's too small, it's too damaged. Yes, the Israelis claim it's there, but it's really it's of very little value. And also, Iranians cannot do anything about Gaza. And getting in the middle of Gaza where they don't actually have anything to play with on the ground. There's no community that is natural to them. There's no organization that they could actually support. What's it going to win them other than the animus of the Saudis and the Qataris and the Egyptians, and then also give more reason to Israel and the United States to corner them? Lebanon is different. It's a huge community. Hezbollah, I guess, they still has value in terms of at least bogging down Israel, and so they're not willing to wash their hands of Lebanon in the way in which they wash their hands of Gaza. It also speaks to the way they're reading things, that there's nothing to play for in Gaza, but there's a lot to play for in Lebanon. And maybe one of the things that is now, I think, I was even hurting Prime Minister Netanyahu as he goes into elections, is that Israel called victory in Lebanon too quickly. It's kind of like mission accomplished with George Bush. So we killed Hassan Nasrallah, we destroyed these things, we've gone into South Lebanon.
You had the pager attacks.
Well, yeah, pager attacks, killing of Hassan Nasrallah, invasion of South Lebanon, capturing of all of these hills. So I finished Hezbollah. And then, but Hezbollah, perhaps Iranians knew this, that was not finished. And Hezbollah, in a way, has been back. It has been killing IDF soldiers. It's been attacking northern Israel
with drones.
With drones, but the political now message inside Israel is that, well, wait a minute, this was not mission accomplished, like you said, just like it was not mission accomplished with Tehran, like you promised, and it's actually politically costing them. So the Iranians have basically, as I said, everybody concluded the end of Hezbollah too quickly, but Tehran knew probably. And Tehran probably knows that there's a lot more to play for in Lebanon. and that if they actually let go of Lebanon, they would be actually vulnerable to Israel. In other words, Israel, its ability to focus on Iran is greatly contingent on how free its hand is in its own neighborhood. And so the Iranians think also that Israel's policies in Lebanon will actually enrage the Shias and actually will strengthen Hezbollah, just like Israel's policies in Iran stabilize the Islamic Republic.
Finally, in another of your brilliant books, The Dispensable Nation, you warned against American foreign policy retreat. Do the events of the past few years, particularly the war with Iran, reflect or contradict the arguments you made in that book?
Well, there's a difference between retreat and bad policy, right? So I think what we are basically seeing is the opposite of retreat, but in a wrong way. So the U.S. basically decided, I'm not going to leave the Middle East immediately. I'm actually going to fix the Middle East, which is also what George Bush Jr. thought he would do with Iraq. I'll remove Saddam, and then there'll be democracy everywhere, and then we'll be done. So in a way, Donald Trump also decided that, and he keeps repeating this, it should have been 47 years ago. I'm the first president in 47 years to deal with Iran. But it all tells you what's in his mind, that I'm not going to dilly-dally with Iran. I don't want to do what Obama did, which was to arrive at Iran good enough so I can go to China. I'll sign a nuclear deal, I pacify Iran enough, and then I go to China. I'm going to actually fix the Iran problem. I'm going to finish this once and for all. And so much like George Bush, this is a case of imperial overreach, not imperial retreat. It's not as if the United States left the region and let the Saudis, Iranians, Pakistanis to duke it out. The Israelis went to war with Iran, and then the U.S. decided that it was going to join in. And so I think what we're seeing is that the U.S. went beyond before. And all the costs that it has incurred and the doubts that it has sowed in the heads of its allies in the region is a consequence of overreach. It exposed the limits of its power by exercising too much of it. And so I think we're facing something very different than that. But put these two things together, going back to the Obama period, where the region was resentful of an America that wanted to pivot to Asia and was willing to cut a deal with Iran to free its own hands to go to Asia. Now they basically are questioning the value of the United States staying in the way that it did in the past. So they were worried that the U.S. would leave and expose them to Iran. But the U.S. stayed, and by its policies actually brought war on them, and then wasn't able to protect them. So it's a different kind of a crisis facing U.S. foreign policy in the region.
But is there a place for that in the Middle East? If you were still in the State Department, what would you push for?
The United States has to systematically think about how will it rebuild relations and trust in the region, but also what is the end goal it wants to see in the region. If you were to say that it's not possible to go back to the day before, let's say October 7th even. In other words, you cannot go back to a period where Arabs and Israelis are still talking about two-state solution, talking about a Sunni-Israeli alliance against Iran, that you can actually keep Iran in this kind of a Goldilocks of sanctions and pressure and yet no war. If that's no longer possible, then what is possible? What does security in the Middle East look like? So security in the Middle East means that Iran and Israel won't be fighting wars with each other. It means that the Iranians and the Arabs won't be fighting wars with each other. It means that you can create enough security in the Gulf that at least most of the Gulf's economy can go back to where it was. That trust in stability can return to Dubai, to Doha, to Abu Dhabi, so the businesses can go back, right? You need to sort of make sure that there is a finality of peace in Gaza, West Bank, Syria, and Lebanon, not out of the kindness of your heart, necessarily a humanitarian concern, but because you don't want these things to explode into other things. So what does it take to get there, right? And actually, at least where we are, step one is the US and Iran actually finishing this war. So you cannot even talk about all of the other things I mentioned without this war finishing. If Iran and the United States cannot go back to this memorandum or a 2.0 version and find a way to diplomatically arrive at a kind of cessation of hostilities that actually the world will begin to believe has legs, the economies of the Gulf are not going to go back to where they were. Doesn't matter what you spend on them, right? The trust isn't there. In a way, it is very difficult, but it's also, as a concept, it's not that difficult. But I think what is lacking right now is a vision in the United States for what would be the regional order look like, what is our goal, and then what is our plan of action for getting there.
Vali, thank you very, very much. That was excellent.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.